So welcome, really terrific to see everyone here for reunions, and I have to say it's really an incredible pleasure to get to bring back spring reunions after a pause for 2 years, and feel the energy and just have you all here, and I hope you all get to enjoy that and benefit from it. I'm really glad to have Professor Neil Malhotra here. We're going to talk a little bit about social impact at the school. I thought I would just start before we get going, just by saying briefly that we've had as you can imagine, just a really unusual last 2 years at the school. The class of 2021, which is back for their first reunion, lived through much of it, and this year has been in many ways just glorious to get everyone back on campus, and you probably got a sense of it outside, but it really has. At least for me, one of the things about the COVID experience is it really has just brought a renewed appreciation for how special this place is at full strength when the faculty are milling around and the students are milling around and the collisions that happen and the alumni that come back to campus. And I think it's reminded all of us of just how unique the environment is on this campus, and how unique it is to have this sort of open architecture on the campus where people come together and there's just room for discussion and collaboration and forming relationships and learning. And it's been great. It's been a very, very special year in many ways. I've been at Stanford for 30 years, and this year it's been a super special a year. So I'm really glad that you get to be coming back for reunions and getting a little bit of a taste of that in this special year. And we'll go to some questions, and happy to talk about all of that. I will say the school I think the state of the school is really strong. We're continuing to see students who are just as brilliant as you all were when you came, and maybe even more brilliant potentially, though that's debatable. We've had a wonderful year with our faculty. We had a faculty member earlier this year win the Nobel. We've had actually the last 2 years we've had 2 Nobel Prizes at the school, which is kind of cool. I mean, we always say we're the one business school that produces incredible business leaders like all of you and Nobel Prizes at the same time. So it's been a good period for that, and we're in a period of really interesting and exciting collaboration with the university, which I think Neil will talk a little bit about that in certain ways, but we're about to start a new climate and sustainability school at Stanford, and that's been a big topic of enthusiasm and excitement this year, is thinking about the intersection of business and sustainability. Of course, that's going to, I think, be an important topic for many, many aspects of business, and the potential that we have to marry some of the incredible science, engineering, climate modeling, and all of that that's going to go on around the university with this new school, with our entrepreneurship, management, leadership, and bring those things together. Okay, so with that, Neil, nice to see you in this context.
Great seeing you.
So Neil is the director of the Center of Social Innovation at the GSB, and maybe just start actually by saying a little bit about how you ended up at the GSB and how you got interested in social innovation.
Sure. So I'm actually a political scientist by training. So I actually did my PhD across the street in the political science department here at Stanford. And I've always been kind of interested in the intersection between business, government, and society. And that's kind of a lot of what my research focus is on. And I would say in 2007, when I was working on all of this, people didn't think it was a big deal. And I would say that since 2008, and just on an exponential trajectory, I think business leaders have to really understand kind of how politics works, how government works, and it's just a crucial part about being a CEO. And I think it was always like this. R.J. Miller, former dean, started the public management program here. But I think really all business leaders, and especially over the last 2 years, including yourself, have realized how important it is to just be in tune with various stakeholders across society. You can't just narrowly focus on my supply chain, my investors, the capital markets, but thinking about activists, stakeholder groups, all of these things. And so because I think that's something I've always been interested in, the intersection of business and society, it kind of naturally led to this leadership role of social innovation and using business not only to intersect with society, but also improve it, to use kind of the functions of management organization to improve and make the world a better place to live in, whether it's health, environment, education, all these sectors.
And so from that perspective, where are you seeing the current student interest? Like, what are the set of problems and issues where you see the most passion these days?
Sure. I think it's always been in the GSB's DNA to be of entrepreneurship, and I kind of view that as a mindset, not an occupation. I think oftentimes we think of entrepreneurship as someone who starts a company and gets Series A funding or something like that, but I think our students, no matter what they choose to do, go out with an entrepreneurial mindset. So that can include working for a small company. It can be innovating within a Fortune 500 company. I think Mary Barra is a great example of that. But I would say that if you think about how students approach their time at the GSB, is that they want to leverage entrepreneurship really for a social function, which is to make the world a better place. And it's unsurprising because over the last 20 years, they've seen traditional institutions fail at making the world a better place. So government, many like large foundations or nonprofits, so they see the private sector as sort of the vehicle to make improvements in all of these sectors. And I think you see the rest of the world do that too, with new forms of organization like B corporations and benefit groups, things like that, impact investing. That's I think where a lot of the student excitement and mindset is how to use the power of organizations and businesses to make everyone's lives better.
And so as your CSI role, you've been spent a lot of time thinking about, what is the pathway for students to get involved in social impact, and how do you create that from the applicant pool and admissions all the way through to careers? Mm-hmm. You want to give everyone a sense of sort of how the strategy has evolved there over time and how you think of it now?
Sure. So I doubt anybody in this audience remembers this, but the PMP used to be a program you would apply to get into, and we don't really do that anymore. We have a general management degree, but I think our application question, what matters to you and why, is just a universally powerful question. And it's a question that I think we admit the kind of students that are very in line with the mission of the Center for Social Innovation. So the selection of people who come in, I never worry about that. So I'm just saying, with all these people who have the right mindset, what kind of programming do we build to really energize and accelerate their career and their dreams? And so we do both curricular and co-curricular programming. So curricularly, we actually run the only certificate you can get at the GSB outside your degree. So as you know, there's only 3 degrees you can get at the GSB: an MBA, an MSX, and a PhD. Many other schools have majors and minors, but we have always believed in a single degree that defines kind of the GSB experience. But we have a history of this certificate in public management and social innovation. And that certificate is organized in many, many courses taught by our full-time faculty, the practitioners who come and teach here. And it basically has a pathway where the first set of classes people take is to really learn an issue, to really learn about the problems facing the education sector, whether it's K through 12 or secondary, healthcare, education. And then we actually teach them about impact measurement, so actually how you actually measure impact when you have a business. And then finally, kind of how you run businesses with all the issues related to scaling, et cetera. So that's kind of the set of classes we teach. But I think what I'm really excited about is all our co-curricular programming. So we, for example, have an impact fund where we have real money that goes into source deals in the impact space. It's basically an impact investing fund that's run by the students. Many other business schools have now copied our idea, which my first reaction was I'm a little bit upset about that, but my second was imitation is always the greatest form of flattery. And it's such a unique program because in a room you can have faculty, students, staff, alumni, all working together on the same mission, which is to deploy this capital for social benefit. And there's something like 13 or 14 companies in the portfolio right now. The students get so much experience on how you present from a management committee, how you source a deal, and it's not theoretical. They're actually taking the real money to do this. So that's a very exciting program. And then the second one is just our social entrepreneurship program, where we have a whole pathway linked to many classes. We teach like Startup Garage, where we kind of have students who have germinal ideas in a social startup, and we take them all the way to start them getting funded, and we have pitch competitions, and we have the flagship is the Social Innovation Fund, which gets them started so that kind of the money is not the reason they don't find their social venture. So just a few weeks ago, we had the finals of it. We awarded some winners. We can't announce the winners right now, but it was just a great event. And it's just really nice how the classroom learning and this kind of extracurricular learning really feed into each other really nicely.
You want to give an example or two of the social entrepreneurial companies that have come through the CSI program? And just, by the way, the students who go through this, at the end, some of them get a small award, but some of them get a significant award so that supports them for a year after graduation to get a social venture off the ground. So that's the big prize that you could get going through this program. And I don't know, maybe you want to give a couple of examples.
Sure, I'll give you a couple of examples. Yeah, and I think these two examples kind of show what social entrepreneurship is about. Like, these are company ideas. You couldn't really go to Sand Hill Road and get Series A funding because they're not like unicorn potential companies, because their goal is to not maximize as much money as possible, but rather to address a social problem. So one of them that was very successful, that was founded a few years ago, found that like one of the major problems in Rwanda was that many people live on dirt floors. And there's been a lot of research to suggest that being on a dirt floor just increases all of these illnesses, including childhood illnesses, which cause people to lose their life within the first 5 years. So her company is basically replacing these floors that are dirt floors with other materials like earthen, concrete, et cetera. And this is like real impact. I think she's already installed over 4 million square feet of flooring. And you know how small people's houses are. That like is so much impact for so many people to put this much flooring to replace. And another example closer to home is that, as people might know, it's a challenge to find childcare for everybody. But for hourly workers, it's incredibly difficult. And a lot of the frictions in the economy right now are because hourly workers cannot find childcare. And so we had a woman who starting a company, and she's doing a pilot with a major Fortune 500 company to basically have these benefits packages to provide childcare for hourly employees. And this is really important because all of the incumbent players in this space, you think of Care.com, Bright Horizons, they don't touch this space because it's very much an innovator's dilemma problem. They know what their niche is, which is the salaried employees. They're moving into things like, how do we get tutoring for these salaried employees, SAT prep? They're not focusing on the lower end of the market, which are these hourly workers. Yet this is where I think a lot of the social impact can be to alleviate this major source of stress for people who really need it. So those are just two examples of what social entrepreneurship is about and really creative, clever ideas that come out of here.
What are the barriers for students who want to do social entrepreneurship?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious one is money, right? That I think students invest a lot when they come here. A lot of that investment is opportunity cost. And it's just very tempting to say, well, even if I want to start a company or go into the social space, I got to work in the private sector first, like kind of what we call kind of profit maximizing private sector first. And then maybe 20 years down the line, I can get back to my dream of working in the social sector. And so that's a barrier. And, I think kind of one dream I have is that people, if they want to, whatever they want to do in the GSB, that money is not the reason they decide to do one thing or the other. So that kind of the finances, I hope, is not going to be the barrier going forward.
I want to ask you a question that I actually don't know what you think on this question, but I'm curious to, just as you're talking, we were talking about, you referred back to the PMP program before, and this question I've thought about, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about, which is that when the PMP program was originally set up, you all know the history of the PMP program was set up by R.J. Miller back in the early 1971. And the goal was to get more GSB students working in government. And I'm curious about how you think about that goal today. It morphed over time into being more about social innovation, social entrepreneurship. But I'm curious how you think about that question of, should we have more students that we're preparing to go into government?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. So I can at least give you some insight based on all the lunches and coffees I have with students. And the Nixon administration actually hired a lot of PMP graduates. It was a really powerful program that changed a lot of how government worked in the 1970s. And the basic idea is that you want to train government officials to have all the skills of managers that they have. And so people working in the administrations, all the bureaucracies, should have the great training that an MBA provides. That was kind of the original thinking, and that maybe government can run more efficiently if you have people with that mindset. That was kind of the idea. And I think over time, a lot of the students, I think there's a few things that are going on. So let's just be honest, there's been a big decline in trust in institutions and trust in government. So it doesn't have the same kind of, like dream big mentality, which is to start at some G7 government job and work your way up. And also, it's hard to see the immediate impact, whereas if you can start a company providing floors in Rwanda tomorrow, that's making impact immediately. And then I also say, one of the key things about the GSB is that, I wish I was a student here, but like the social bonds that are built and also the communities people build that are very tied to places like the Bay Area is a very strong pull. And also, people spend 2 years here, they just love it here, and they want to stay here. And the idea of just uprooting and moving to Washington, D.C. or Sacramento or wherever it might be, I think that's kind of lost a lot of its luster compared to the 1970s. So that's at least just my perception. And students are finding other ways. And I think if you think about it, I think a lot of their vision is if I have like a successful private sector career, then 20 years later I can make a higher impact, not as like a G7 employee, but as an advisor, a political appointee. And obviously there's many GSB alumni with that record, like Penny Pritzker and others. And so I think that's what we've seen over the last 20 years.
I'm glad I asked you that, actually, because I have the same exact view as you do. So that was really that was really terrific to me. And actually, by the way, I think one thing that I will actually be curious to get your thoughts about whether I feel that now our current students are more interested in doing public sector careers at some point in the future than, say, was the case at Stanford some years ago. I wonder if you have that view as well.
I do, and I think it really is about how you scale impact. And I mean, when you talk to a lot of students, that's the mindset they have, which is, and I think it's our motto, right? Which is change organizations, change lives, change the world. I mean, if you really want to change the world, it's really hard to do that from the private sector alone. And so I think kind of going into the public sector after a long career is very enticing to a lot of people because it's really a way they can scale the impact that they've had in their professional careers.
Let me come back to you started with this point that was broader than social impact about the sort of overarching relationship between business and society. So you teach you're right in the middle of this because you teach the first year class that was ethics and now you've turned it into leading with values. So I'd love to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about that transformation of the first year fall class and how we ended up going from having an ethics class to a class that was about leading with values and what that even means.
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of this kind of started when a book publisher heard about the course and asked me to write me and my co-instructor, Ken Schatz, to write a book about the course. And, you have to have a title for a book. I don't think you can just call the book the name of your class. So we instead said, okay, like what would be a good title for a book? And then decide to rename the class what the book is called. So that's kind of the history of it. So the book is called Leading with Values. And I think maybe kind of our mindset of the class hasn't shifted, but I think what you're saying is right, which is part of leadership, and you know this as much as anybody, not only with your job, but also talking to all the CEOs you do, which is, fundamentally, people follow leaders because they're presenting values that people provide compelling. If your only value that you're offering anybody is that I'll give you X amount of dollars for this amount of work, people will do the minimum amount possible to not get fired. And in this economy right now, that's very little, given where the labor market is right now. But rather, what keeps people like burning the midnight oil and really committed is a set of values that you kind of say, like, this is the values of this organization. And the challenging thing is that people in organization bring different kinds of values. And so how do you both respect the diversity of values in your organization, but also lead with a set of core values? So on the first day of class, we actually showed this video of when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 1997. So this is when Apple was a crappy company, like really low stock price, and not the $1 trillion plus behemoth it is now. This is, because they hadn't had the iMac or iPad or anything. And he gives a speech, and the speech is basically to the engineers, all of whom have offers at all of the hot .coms, and he's trying to keep them at Apple. And he says, what is the core value of Apple? And he says the core value of Apple is not making boxes that help people get their jobs done, even though they do that better than anybody. He says the core value of Apple is basically to enable people who want to change the world the ability to do so. And the way he put it is, and they had a whole advertising campaign based on this, is that Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Leonardo da Vinci, they never had a computer. But if they had a computer, it would have been a Mac. And that is what Apple is. It is the computer for those kind of people and the people who buy those computers. And this is the ethos or values that drives that company. And just like Apple has those values, I think every leader of any organization has to say, what are the core values that this organization represents? And I think when you frame the class like that, it's beyond just like ethics, right? It's beyond like not having accounting fraud. It's that what is the purpose of my life and what is the purpose of my work and how do I manage a diverse organization? Because a big thing that's coming up is that you have employees revolting because they don't like the stances of a company on some social issue. So we try to provide frameworks in the class that say we're going to have tough discussions in this class. You might disagree with students, but that's not a reason to be disagreeable. That how do we actually have diverse opinions in this classroom and have tough discussions? And really that's what the class is about.
There's so much to unpack there that I think people would love to hear. Let me just pick up on the last point, though, which is the having tough discussions in the classroom. I think everybody is reading all the time how hard that's gotten, and you and Ken do that in the class. How do you do it?
Yeah, it's tough. Me and Ken worry every day we're going to get fired or something because of something that comes up in the classroom. But, I think it's really important that we don't shy away from tough discussions in the classroom because it's such a core part of educating business leaders. Because if you shy away now, you're eventually going to have to confront them in the real world. So the first two classes, we just set a great tone. And so the first class, really the lesson of that class is that what is the definition of the value? And fundamentally, the definition of a value is a story. So what do I mean by that? And so there's some things in this world that are not stories, they're facts, like gravity, right? So it doesn't matter if you believe in gravity or not, it's gonna have an effect on you. You can't just like walk off a cliff like Wile E. Coyote and I'm now over the cliff, now I fall. Whereas most things in this world, actually, they do work like the Wile E. Coyote. They do work that people have to then realize that they're off the cliff and then fall. So what do I mean by that? So human rights, for example, is a story. Like justice is a story. Money is a story. They're things that are only real because people believe in them and they give them meaning. And so once you kind of define a value that way, people then realize maybe I was taught different stories than my classmates growing up. And maybe that's why we disagree, because we've been taught a different way the world works, not because something is true or untrue. And then you have more empathy. And then in the second class, we teach them about a theory, which some of you might have heard about. It's called moral foundations theory. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, which kind of talks about this theory. And it says a lot of how we approach these ethical issues, either in our lives, in business, in politics, is that we have these moral senses. So he has senses like fairness and harm and authority, liberty, etc. And these are all good senses that people have, but some people put more weight on some of them than others. And it's sort of like how some people have really good eyesight, but not so good hearing, and other people have really good hearing, but not such great eyesight. And if you realize that the values that we differ on are just different senses we have, and like the number of true sociopaths in the classroom is probably 0, that everyone's trying to do the right thing. And it's just that we differ on what the values are we put weight on. And I think that sets a nice tone for the class, which allows for disagreement, debate, and discussion later on.
You mentioned basically the new complexities for business leaders that have come up because of the way that societal issues have intersected with business issues. And we're probably, many of us are just in the middle of that in our jobs, and others are reading about it all the time. So I'm curious about what guidance you have for leaders today of organizations about how to navigate those situations where you have employees maybe who have very different views than your customers or the government or the politicians. Disney comes to mind as a case where they had obviously lots of different stakeholders, different views. How do you think about that?
It is such a tough issue. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it because, I think the Disney example is like they're just in a very tough position where kind of no matter what they were going to do, like, so you would say, oh, just don't say anything. Well, they did that and that didn't work. Then it's like, okay, well, take a position. They did that and now they have their own set of problems. And I think it's sort of just, I think there's 2 answers to that. So one is if you just as a leader have a set of core conviction and values, it can help really guide you steady throughout that. And then second, one thing we do in the class is we give students a vocabulary for how you actually explain decisions. And really, I think these frameworks apply to almost all of these, because most of life, for example, is just a trade-off of good stuff. And if you kind of explain, like we're not getting this good thing, but we're getting this other good thing, I think it can help give people the vocabulary to explain value. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So, one thing that's really nice is if you grow a pie that's as big as possible for everybody. But a trade-off is that sometimes to grow a big pie, you might have to make the slices of that pie uneven, that it leads to kind of problems in distribution. On the other hand, you might shrink the pie for everybody, but make the slices more even. So if you're going to shrink the pie, that might make a lot of people in your organization mad. But if you can explain that, like, we're doing it because we're making the slices more equal, then people can understand it better. So, one thing we teach about is kind of the framework of the veil of ignorance that John Rawls had. And many of our students, especially our international students, this is the first time they're encountering these ideas. And it kind of blows their mind. And if you kind of explain to them, well, one way to justify, a decision is to say, if you didn't know who you were going to be in this company, like, you're the vice president of marketing, but if you could have been a janitor in this company, what would be the rules that you would have and kind of do? And then what do you think that would be? And just having that kind of language to put people behind the veil of ignorance, to think empathetically, it can actually make it more convincing to do things that are going to shrink the pie, right? Because it might increase something else good, like fairness or distribution.
The issue of inequality that you're raising, you're a political scientist. You actually spend a lot of your time thinking about inequality, and I'm wondering how that comes up in the class. Issues of inequality in your Leading with Values class, and how you broach those issues with students.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this comes down to the debate between kind of stakeholder and shareholder capitalism. When we have a whole kind of session 2 maybe where we kind of break out what this actually means. And students kind of differ on that. I would say, some students, we teach them kind of what Milton Friedman says about why it's actually a moral argument to only care about your shareholders' interests, because it's their money. And if you do what you want and don't do what your shareholders want, you're stealing their money, essentially. That's kind of his argument. And then we talk about other ways of thinking about it, which is to think about the fact that the only reason the company has highways for people to get to work, the only reason they have employees that have an education system is that they're part of a broader society, and there's a social contract that companies are part of, that they have to look out for multiple stakeholder interests. And we don't take a side on that. Some students say, yes, we only take into account stakeholder interest because it's for long-term shareholder value. And others say, no, we have to kind of take into account things like inequality, et cetera. Even if the government isn't doing something, the companies have to take it. And we don't take a side on that. We actually have those tough discussions. I'd also say this issue comes up in CSI a lot. So I don't know if people know about this book called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas. And that book, I'll be honest with you, basically is just everything we do at CSI is bad, right? It's a big broadside against philanthropy, impact investing, social entrepreneurship. And the argument he makes is that these things kind of paper over structural inequality caused by lack of government regulation and policies. And I've always responded to that saying it's not an either or thing, right? That I think our students are very interested in structural reform on issues like inequality, and they view that until those happen, business actually plays a big role in potentially reducing some of those inequalities. But we teach about all of this stuff because I think for business leaders to go out there having a sense that their businesses are embedded in a broader social framework where issues like inequality are becoming a bigger problem, I think is important.
Where would you say, if you had to kind of size it up for these folks, where would you say our students are on the stakeholders, shareholders? If you sort of, what would you say the student perspective is these days?
I take a vote actually after we have a small group, and after, the great thing is we have a really in-depth discussion and then we do the vote. And I would say, almost none of our students believe that the goal is to increase the shareholder price in the next quarter so you keep your job as CEO. Like that's not really how our students think. They're much more nuanced than that. I would say 75% of them believe in what you would call an enlightened Milton Friedman view, which is my job is to maximize shareholder value, and the way I do that long term is by being sensitive and cognizant of shareholder interests or stakeholder interests. And that encapsulates things like regulatory risk of being canceled on social media, like all of that stuff. And I would say 25% believe in what you would call a pluralistic stakeholder model, which is that there are edge cases where you would choose a stakeholder, whether it's your employees, an indigenous community somewhere, things like that, over the shareholder interests, even if it might damage the shareholder value. So I would say it's like 75-25.
All right, now I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is, if you think back to you mentioned Milton Friedman. If you think back, so I'm an economist, so I'm just going to have to give you a little Milton Friedman for a moment. But if you think back, Milton Friedman was writing in the early 1970s, right? It was a time of incredible social unrest, a lot of debates about business, its role in society, and so forth. And Friedman's ideas won the day, 1971, right? And the Chicago School won the day. All right, so let's say we're going to have the Stanford School that starts in 2022, articulates a different view of what capitalism is going to look like, or maybe a view of what capitalism is going to look like, and that's the next 50 years. What's your view of what it should be?
That's a really hard question. That's like really putting me on the spot here. I actually think that's a lot of what our faculty are working on, frankly, and it's actually why we have over 100 people doing the research on these questions. Looking at how marketplaces are going to be structured from an economics perspective. Looking at how you have behavior change from an OB perspective. I think that's what we're all doing. I don't think it's like my personal opinion on how to do that. But I think it is. I think that's something that's very hard to predict. And the one thing I just see right now that's I think very challenging for business leaders is that I would say the divide between business elites and the mass public has never been as far as it's been for a long time. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And society has changed a lot. But I think the image of the 1950s of the business leader, in the Rotary Club, doing the community service, embedded in the community, running the company town, we have to find what is the 21st century version of that. Because it can't be what was the last 20 years, which is like a single-minded, how do you increase the stock price for the next quarter? That's just not going to work anymore. But running the Rotary Club in the town with high amounts of social capital, that's also probably not the solution. I think our society's kind of past that. So I think you have to think creatively, which is like, how, as a business leader, as a person, going to be running a company, but also be embedded in their society, building social capital in their communities. And I wish I had an easy answer for that. But it's very hard when people are glued to their phones, 10 hours a day, and it could be even harder 20 years from now when people are in the metaverse and things like that. So, or easier, who knows? But I think it's very hard to predict what 50 years is going to be like when things change so fast. You can't even predict what 5 years is going to be like.
One thing that's just interesting to me in what you're saying is, when you think about the way that the role of people's relationships to their jobs and to companies has changed over time, with the decline of trust in government and with the decline of civic organizations and some of the Rotary clubs, so to speak, that you're talking about, people look much more to their companies and their employers to fill gaps that were not there, whether it's in solving societal problems or just providing a social fabric. And of course, they want that social fabric to align with their values. And so, I think that's such an interesting set of points you're raising, and it helps you to see the link between, dedicated careers or aspirations around social impact, whether it's impact investing or social entrepreneurship, and just the way you're teaching all of our students about the roles they might play as leaders in organizations. I think that's really an interesting, important set of points.
How would you answer that question, though, about how you think capitalism is going to
I thought I was asking you the questions.
Well, that was only fair when you were asking easy questions. So now that you're asking a very hard question, I'm curious what your view on it is.
All right, I'm going to tell, I've got two stories, but then I'll give my answer. But I'll just say, we have a class in the winter, of course, the leading values in the fall quarter. In the winter quarter, we now have a corporate finance class was turned into a corporate governance class. Basically, because if you thought about the things that were you think what's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal when the class was originally designed in 1990, it was all debt and equity and leverage buyouts and things like that. What's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal now? It's stakeholder capitalism, basically. It's what are CEOs saying? What is the Twitter board going to do when Elon Musk comes and wants to buy it? How are they going to resolve the price versus the effects on democracy and all that? So I went in I do a session every year in that on stakeholders versus shareholders, and we went in this year, and just like you do, we did a survey of where are people aligned among the students. And the students came out 92%, hard on the stakeholder side. And there were like 4 people who were Milton Friedman people, and then like 4 who refused to answer. And so I came into the class and I said, you know what? Like, with a bunch of us who were in a panel, and I said, I'm going to just stake out the hardline Milton Friedman position, because I actually want you to hear it. And I think you should hear all the views, and then we can argue about them. And it was so much fun, actually. We just repeated it on Wednesday. We decided to have a second round where people could argue it again, and we got the group together again on Wednesday for lunch. So let me preface it by saying the Friedman view, which is how I was educated as an economist, which is that appreciating that business is all about solving people's problems. Every business starts because you see some problem in the world, and then you go out and solve it. And having clarity about what is the problem you're solving and how do you create value for people so they'll pay you, actually that's great. That's the source of innovation. That's the reason the United States grew for 150 years, and it's what's brought people out of poverty all across the world. It's an amazingly powerful thing. But I think what I would add to that is that we now are in a world where the bifurcation, where businesses were doing that, and we left it to government to solve big societal challenges, is not necessarily working that well. And I view the part of the failing of our political institutions, and maybe the decline of civic institutions and other things, has just left this void where, in some sense, business is more trusted than these other areas and does need, in certain ways, to stand in. And the hard part for companies and for leaders today is just trying to do exactly what you were talking about, which is figure out where do you step in. Because you can't solve every problem in the world. If you're running a software business, you can't, you got to figure out which are the places where you could make a difference and have impact in a company as a leader. And I think that has, I think that has actually made the world much, much harder for business leaders than it was even 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think, when I think of like the challenge we have today of educating students, I'm sure you all were hard to educate too, but maybe you were a little bit easier and in some sense you went out into a little bit less complicated world than our students are about to graduate into. And so there's an enormous onus on us now, and I think everyone was inspired by hearing how you're doing it, because it's incredible, to actually prepare students to go out into that world and navigate all those complexities and figure out, how am I going to build and lead an organization, or participate and help to build an organization, or invest in organizations that are going to, create value for people and hopefully not do damage to society, but actually reinforce society and all the institutions that we need collectively to thrive. And that's a great mission. It makes it exciting to be at Stanford Business School. One thing I'll finish by saying, and then I'm going to go to questions take a few questions, is the nice thing about being in a world where things are all mixed up and complicated is it's a great time to be in school. Mm-hmm. And I mean that in both ways. One is it's probably nice not to be working at Twitter right now, but the other is that it's interesting to be here because people are arguing about all the things that they're doing in Neil's class, and the questions are hard and fun, and you get into them, and that's really exciting. And Stanford's a place where you can have many ideas that flourish. And so you can actually have those discussions that everyone wants to and hopes that we could have in this country, or at least we're trying to do that. And you're doing it in your class as well as I've ever seen anyone do it, which is amazing. So let's take a couple questions, and we're the only thing that stands between you and a beer. So we'll just take a couple, but if anyone has questions, we will take our best shot at them. Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Nadeem. So I work for a private company that's not profitable and growing quickly. It's about 3,000 people. So there's a lot of tensions in where to invest capital. But as we're getting bigger and hopefully public someday, I already see a lot of demand, pressure, tension to become de facto government or community, right? Whatever those demands are from the employee base. So how do you think about, maybe this comes up in class, balancing people selecting where they want to work and having the values be really clear versus every company has to address every possible employee demand or value. Like, how do you, Twitter's I guess an example of that, but how do you think of that more generally?
Well, I'll give my thing. You can respond.
I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, I'll just say there's different models, and I'm not going to say what's the right model. I think our job is to just discuss it, just say this is what the world looks like to the students, and then they can kind of select. So I don't know if you know about Coinbase. So Coinbase, had a very interesting mission statement, which is this is not going to be a political company. If you think this is a political company, we don't want you to work here. And that's a red line in the sand, and they're just hoping that selection works, and that's what it is. And we'll see what happens with them, but that's kind of an approach to take, to say we're not going to be a government or serve those functions. On the other hand, there's other companies that are clearly causing externalities in the world, like ExxonMobil. There's just no doubt about it, is that they create externalities. They do a lot of great stuff, they create energy that has saved countless lives over the history of the last 50 years. Fossil fuels are responsible for so much saving of life, and now they could be damaging a lot of life. That's why the world is complex. There's trade-offs. And they have to say, okay, well, normally you would say, well, the government is going to make the decisions. They're either going to provide subsidies for fossil fuels, they're going to have carbon taxes, whatever they do, they're going to do, and we're going to be in those constraints, and we're not going to be the government. But they actually have a lot more harder questions that they've had to face. So one is, how do you lobby, right? Do you lobby to change those regulations? And Milton Friedman never mentions the word lobbying once in his article. And it's kind of a blind spot in that article. And then the second thing is that they've done something that I study, which is called outside lobbying. So they create their own organizations, and the fossil fuel industry has in the past created organizations that have spread climate change misinformation. So, like, is that something that was appropriate for them to have done? It was good for shareholder value, they would claim, but was it the right ethical thing to do? And so I would say there's different models, but I think companies have to ask themselves hard questions, which is, one, do we just want to say we're not a government? And that could be what your company ends up doing. Or say, well, do we restrain ourselves from being in the social sector at all, including lobbying and influence, knowing that's not maximizing shareholder value, but might be the right thing to do, and actually trust government to have its true regulatory function separate from government, from company influence? I don't know what you think.
You know, I worry about a world where people sort among their jobs the way they sort among many other things, like the places where they live, based on the sort of things that they believe or their political preferences. I think that I worry about what that would do to this country. It's already happening in some sense. I mean, you look at the political skew of the tech companies, say, versus other industries, say the fossil fuel industries. They're very, very different. And I think one of the problems in our country today is exactly that there's not enough mixing of people who have different views or different ideologies or different preferences. We need to push back against that. I mean, that is a central challenge for us here at the university, because it's so important to have the free flow of ideas and people taking different positions and have that whole spectrum. And it's hard for companies. I look at even just companies that here in our local companies that have all kinds of challenges with employees getting on the internal message boards and fighting it out and creating challenges. But I actually think it's a good thing. The more you can have companies where you have an employee workforce where people are who have very different preferences, who might have different political ideologies, who might have different backgrounds, just different in every possible way, and they can come together around a common mission. That's powerful. And I'll just give you one example. Neil mentioned Mary Barra, our alum, General Motors, 220,000 employees. That's a really broad and diverse workforce in like every possible dimension. And I thought one of the amazing things that happened during the pandemic was when, right at the beginning of the pandemic, when Mary said we're gonna start producing ventilators, and they opened up a factory that was closed, and they started producing ventilators. Actually, there was a whole group of, this wasn't in the news, but there was a whole group of other GSB alumni who were in Washington, that were helping coordinate that with the government. Came out of, I think they were all at Bain, and then they came and went to Washington and worked in the class of 2015 was the class that a lot of them came from. And that was great. I mean, what a great thing. Isn't that what you want to see in this country, is people from so many different backgrounds, perspectives, come together on a mission, and if it can happen inside a company, that's a win for the country. So that's how I would think about it. But of course, I don't have to be in one of those companies and then deal with all the people, fighting it out with each other. I just have to be at Stanford dealing with all the people who are have different perspectives. Yeah.
I'm class of 2002, so for me, what's really interesting, I haven't been in school for a long time, and it's great to hear what students are talking about and how the program runs. I think many of us who are hiring people, we're facing exactly the same issues, right? Because today, it's not enough anymore to say, like, we're a company that's going to produce a lot of profit. You're going to be part of that. You're going to help us grow. Everyone wants to know there's values in the company, whatever they are. I'm really worried, though, about the other topic that you, Dean, talked about, which is the political process and the political fabric. I think it's incredibly hard to operate in a country where the political process is increasingly broken. We've got a hard time getting a budget. I've talked with Bob Gates recently about the situation in the Pentagon, where military programs are being underfunded, and it just seems consensus is much harder to find. Now, I think for a company to prosper, you have to be in a country that actually has a certain structural framework or legal framework that allows you to do business. So I think it's a really worrying trend. Can you share with us a little bit what your students today think about that and how they see the political process and what your take is on that? I think it's one of the biggest threats that we face as a Western world.
I'm kicking that one to you because you are one of the leading American political scientists. So,
I mean, I would say that from the students' perspective, when I came in 2008, there was really not that much political interest among the students. I mean, like they kind of did, but it wasn't, I think it was like, oh, I'm a business person first and foremost. And just over the last 14 years, exactly for the reasons you're talking about, I think they've naturally realized this is something we've got to really care about, talk about, discuss. You're exactly right. You need to have well-functioning institutions to have a good capitalist economy. And I know political economists have debated what comes first. Does the institutions come first or the capitalism come first? I personally believe the institutions come first. Like I think you need to have good institutions. And I'll give you an example. We have Keith Hennessy teaches one of the most popular classes, and the class has almost nothing to do with business. It's just kind of like how you pass bills in Washington. And it's one of the most popular classes in the entire school. And he's like a hardcore Republican, where I would say like the median student probably, voted for Joe Biden. And they're taking the class for someone who worked for George W. Bush. And I think that reflects not only he's a great teacher, it's a great class, but also I think the students, share a lot of what you're thinking, which is you really have to be educated in this stuff to be a good business leader, to help strengthen and build our institutions, not undermine them. And I don't want to get too political here, but like it's interesting because like you had a lot of companies after the insurrection say we're not going to donate to some people who were involved in the insurrection. And then you have like Toyota now like reversing that decision, and like FEC records are now showing they have been donating. So I think these are tough questions. And the students are really interested in them, and exactly for the reasons, because it's the bedrock of a strong, successful capitalist economy, is having a strong democracy.
I'll just add one sort of twist on that, which is the school has over time expanded the number of students who are international students. Actually, this year's MBA 1 class, because we had some international students deferred during the pandemic, 46% of the class is international. That's higher than normal and probably higher than next year's class will be, but it's been in the low 40s, and there's students in the class now from 65 or 70 countries. And increasingly more students who come from Latin America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, who come from countries that don't have necessarily stable political institutions. And I think those questions around, both like the importance of political institutions as a foundation for business, and also the role of business in helping to bolster political institutions and build stronger institutions of rule of law, they are so enriched by having those students, because they just come in and actually all those questions are obvious to them. It's like, yes, you do. If you don't have, you don't want your country to be Venezuela. It's really hard to run a business there. So how do you have more stable political institutions? That's a absolute precursor. Go ahead, sir.
Well, I said I love having all students who have in their lives undergone democratic transitions.
Yeah.
And it's kind of in those middle income countries too, where there's been democratic backsliding. Like they grew up in a democracy and now they came here from kind of an autocratic government, and they're just a great perspective to teach our American students. And they're a great perspective to teach the students who are from weaker political institutions. And just having the international diversity is so great, because not only do they bring different cultural perspectives, different business perspectives, but these different political perspectives as well. And I've just learned so much talking to students who've actually lived through democratic transition, And
I'll give you one example in the reverse, which was really inspiring earlier this winter. But when the war in Ukraine started, we have a non-trivial number of students, both from Russia and from the Ukraine. And it was hugely upsetting to everyone, but it was really devastating to the students from those countries and also from Eastern Europe, other affected areas. And one of the first things that the students did, the Russian students and the Ukrainian students together, was to organize a discussion for all of their classmates to just talk about it. And I just thought that was about the greatest thing that had happened, that they sort of came together and had this discussion, hosted all their classmates, and they've done a couple of those, and it was great. It was inspiring. You also could, if you get a chance, you should read about one of our MBA students who's Ukrainian, Kate Slyankova, who organized this really heroic humanitarian effort to bring medical supplies into the Ukraine, and got a former military, now current medical school student at Stanford to fly the supplies over in a chartered plane. So that was a recent effort that happened here on campus just after the war started. It was great. It was really, really exciting.
So it sounds like a phenomenal class and program. And so two quick questions. One is there any sort of executive education, continuing studies, or online manifestation of it? I don't self-identify a lot in this space, but I found this super engaging and would love to, maybe others are interested. That's part one. And part two, both of the books you mentioned, I think Jonathan Haidt and Winner Takes All, were favorites of mine. I'm wondering if you have a tip for us, a favorite blogger, podcaster, columnist, economist, or a writer, just something that we might take up for summer reading if we're interested in this type of space. And to both of you, if you're, to the extent you have an answer.
Yeah.
Why don't you start?
Are there programs, are there executive programs with this? You have an executive program, but it's not, would you say it falls into this category?
Is this the
Sort of thinking about these sort of issues, well.
the PE one?
Yeah.
We do have a program on what you would call kind of reputation management and kind of political economy and these kind of issues and business government relations. We do have one. I believe it's being taught this summer. Also, CSI has put a lot of stuff online. So we recently published a book with Harvard Business Review Press, which basically kind of shares our curriculum with the world. So you can, that book, if you're interested, it's basically our curriculum right there, and then we have a lot of online content that goes with the book. So if you kind of go to our website, you'll see all these videos we have on impact investing and modeling and theory of change and all of the concepts that are in the book.
I think, though, that you're planting an interesting seed, because I would say in our executive programs, all these issues we've been talking about, I think, do come in now, because it's just so critical to leadership, and we have leaders who want to find out what's going on, but we haven't necessarily. Our executive education has been extremely disrupted during the pandemic. Like, it went to zero during the pandemic, and now we're restarting it, and we haven't developed something that would be around, say, this kind of leading with values or leading in a time of sort of social turbulence. And maybe that's what you'll have to do next summer.
You just gave me like a new job to do, so thank you for that. Yeah.
All right, we're at quarter of, and I think everyone could use a beer at this point in the day. I certainly could. So let me just thank you all for being here. I have to say today, just like walking around the campus and seeing, this was the first day that we've had at the GSB the entire year. We did have fall reunions, but everyone was wearing masks all the time and a little nervous about interacting with each other. And I think as I was walking campus today, I said to someone, this is the first day the entire year where I have really felt like we're at full strength. We've got the faculty here, we've got the students here, the staff is here, and the alumni are here, and it feels great. So thank you for doing that, and I hope you just have a really wonderful reunion. We're so happy to have you back.